Starved people, innocent lives lost to hunger. Between life and death. They were a people who spoke to the sky, listened to the earth, and heard the voice of life in the whisper of the river. But one day the sky grew silent, the rivers dried, and the ground was covered with the dead. When the white men arrived, the natives still believed in humanity. They believed that God was for everyone. But the newcomers came speaking of God, with rifles in their hands. The first thing to die was hope. The whites began slaughtering the buffalo, the lifeblood of the native nations. Buffalo was their food, clothing, shelter, tools, even their firewood. When the buffalo disappeared, the heart of the people stopped beating. The U.S. Army and hunters discovered an easy way to kill Indians without bullets. They called it buffalo hunting. From the windows of moving trains, men fired into herds for sport, leaving millions of carcasses to rot under the sun. Across the plains, the smell of decay filled the air, and swarms of flies darkened the sky. Children cried as the stench of death clung to their homes. The villages emptied. The elders watched their grandchildren die of hunger and lifted their eyes to a silent sky. Mother's milk dried up. Children chewed on bark to survive, but no one came to help. The U.S. government drove them into reservations, barren lands where nothing grew. The promised rations, flour and meat, often never came or arrived rotten, worm-infested, unfit for life. In some tribes, people were forced to eat the flesh of the dead. Military reports wrote it coldly as extreme starvation. But behind those words were the faces of mothers, children, and broken souls. In one village, there was no food for a week. An old woman wrapped her grandchild in a hide and whispered, "Sleep until we find food." That was her last lullaby, the voice of hunger itself, the final echo of a people disappearing from the world. The last breath of the buffalo. The fate of a nation that had lived beneath the open sky for thousands of years changed in a single generation. For the natives, the buffalo was not merely an animal, it was the beating heart of life itself. When it was gone, their world collapsed. Across the prairies, millions of bones lay scattered. White settlers posed for photographs beside towering piles of skulls, smiling proudly, unaware that every skull represented a starving child, a vanished family, a broken people. The buffalo was not food alone. It was their spirit. When the last one fell, entire tribes mourned as though a god had died. Women tore their hair, children wept against the earth, and the old men stood silent, eyes full of ashes. And the government rejoiced. Now they can no longer resist. From that moment, hunger became a weapon. It replaced the bullet and the sword. The army cut off supplies, declaring that food must only be distributed through official channels. But those channels were empty. No grain, no meat, no mercy. The tribes tried to plant crops on the dry plains, but the land was salt and stone. Rain did not fall, and even when it did, the soil refused to live. Elders handed children small stones and said, "This is bread." The little ones believed them. Hunger drives a mind into madness. In some villages, people lay buried halfway in the ground, looking up at the sky, waiting for rain, for death, for anything. Mothers starved themselves to keep their children alive. When rations arrived, they were spoiled, crawling with worms. The government's records noted only food shipments delayed, supplies reduced. But that reduction was a death sentence. A Lakota chief once said, "They have taken our land. Now they want to take our souls with hunger." And they did. The weak came to the camps willingly, trading freedom for a handful of flour. Hunger broke the proudest warriors without a single shot fired. In 1877 alone, More than 20,000 natives died of starvation in Dakota and Lakota lands. Whole villages disappeared. When soldiers rode out in winter, they found bodies frozen beneath the snow, some kneeling, still praying for rain. The policy of conquering by food. In Washington, they called it the Indian solution. But in truth, it was a slow extermination, carefully wrapped in bureaucracy and ink. General Philip Sheridan, the same man who once said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," advised Congress that killing the buffalo was the key to breaking native resistance. And so they did. Train passengers were encouraged to shoot buffalo from the windows just for sport. The plains turned black with carcasses. Once the herds were gone, the reservations began to grow, not as homes, but as prisons without walls. The government agents who managed them had one mission: control through dependency. They cut food rations to punish, increased them to reward obedience. If a chief refused to sign a treaty, his people would starve within weeks. It was written in official reports as policy efficiency. But in truth, it was genocide by hunger. Children with swollen bellies lay beside empty kettles. Their mothers whispered prayers, but the wind took their words away. The priest came, offering bread in exchange for baptism. The hungry ones accepted, not out of faith but desperation. They said God would save us, one Lakota woman recalled. But the bread they gave us tasted like sorrow. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, newspapers wrote proudly of civilizing the Indian problem. They praised the progress of reservations and called starvation discipline. To the public, it sounded like mercy. To the people living it, it was slow death behind fences. When protests rose, the government replied coldly, "We cannot feed those who refuse to work." But what work could there be when their land was stolen, their herds gone and their spirits crushed? Men who had once hunted for miles now stood in ration lines, silent and hollow-eyed. Each month the list of the dead grew longer. And yet, through the silence of despair, one thing remained unbroken: memory. They remembered the wind that once carried buffalo thunder. They remembered freedom like a dream that still burned in the dark. The schools of silence. When the bodies stopped falling from hunger, the government found a new way to kill a people through their children. It began with a promise: "We will feed and educate your young." But the truth was darker than famine. The boarding schools were built not for learning, but for erasure. Children were taken by force, torn from the arms of their mothers, dragged away by soldiers on horseback. They were forbidden to speak their language, forbidden to pray in their own way, forbidden even to remember who they were. Their hair was cut short and a sacred part of their identity, and their clothes were burned. New names were given: John, Mary, Peter. Old names were erased from existence. "Kill the Indian, save the man." That was the motto of Captain Richard Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. They beat children who spoke their tribal tongue. They starved those who tried to escape. Some froze to death in winter fields while running home. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the schools. When food was scarce, the children were fed moldy bread, watered-down soup, and sometimes nothing at all. Many died quietly in their sleep, not from disease but from loneliness and hunger. Letters from parents were thrown away. No mother's hug, no father's voice, no drumbeat, only the sound of a bell calling them to prayer in a foreign faith. In reports sent to Washington, it was written as progress. In the hearts of survivors, it was the echo of cultural death. Some who survived forgot their language forever. Some never spoke again. And some, when they returned home, found their families already gone, starved or moved to another reservation. Thus, the chain of grief was complete. The body was killed by hunger, the soul by silence. The winter without songs. The winter of 1883 was remembered as the winter without songs. Across the northern plains, silence swallowed the camps. The drums were gone. The laughter of children had vanished. Even the wolves stopped howling, as if the land itself mourned. The snow covered the bodies of those who had died from hunger. Mothers laid their children beneath buffalo hides, whispering ancient songs through frozen tears. When spring came, there was no one left to bury them. The land became white, said an old Lakota man, but not from purity, went from death. In some camps, people ate grass and tree bark. In others, they boiled leather shoes to survive another night. One soldier later confessed in his diary, "We starved them until they signed. They said yes only when their children began to die." And yet the official report spoke of successful negotiations. The U.S. government celebrated the opening of new territories, land cleared of Indian presence. But that land was watered with tears, bones, and hunger. Missionaries preached salvation while standing over graves. "Accept Christ and you will live," they said. But the people had already met death and found no God there. Children's small footprints led away from camps, fading into the snow. Some made it to the woods and froze in their mother's arms. Some were never found. When the wind blew over the plains, it carried not songs, but names. The names of those erased, whispered again and again, as if the earth refused to forget. One woman, before dying, said to a soldier, "You can take our land, our food, even our breath. But when the wind touches your face, know it is us. I'm still here." That winter ended, but the silence it left behind still lingers, heavy as snow, across the land that once fed nations. The hunger that never ended. History says the wars ended, but the hunger never did. Long after the rifles went silent, the reservations remained vast open-air prisons where survival itself was rebellion. The treaties that promised food and aid became empty paper, eaten away by time and lies. Each generation inherited not land but scarcity. The people were taught to forget, but memory has its own heartbeat. In the sound of the wind and the smell of burning sage, in the taste of bitter roots, the old grief still speaks. It says, "We were starved not because there was no food, but because we refused to kneel." Modern America grew fat on the land that once fed those who died starving. Cattle now graze where buffalo once thundered. Highways run through burial grounds. Tourists take photos where mothers once wept. And still, hunger walks among their descendants. Not the hunger of the body, but of justice, of a voice long denied, of a people who watched the richest land on earth become their graveyard. "They tried to make us ghost," said a Sioux elder. But ghosts remember. Each winter the survivors gather and light fires for the lost. They sing songs once forbidden, not in sorrow but defiance, because to speak in their tongue is to breathe again. To remember is to rise again. The story of the starving tribes is not just tragedy. It is a mirror, a warning to every nation that calls conquest civilization. Because once America starved the first people of its soil to feed its own greed, and in that act something in its own soul began to die. The wind still carries their cries across the plains, not as ghosts but as truth. And when that truth is heard, even the living grow silent.